These are your video notes for the evidence for evolution, and we're going to briefly cover 5 topics or 5 genres or groups of evidence that we have and use to figure out which organisms are evolutionarily related to each other and how far back they go in time. So we'll do these in turn, but really quick. Fossil record we have talked about before. Comparative anatomy, embryology, which is just very early development. Molecular, that includes DNA and protein sequences. And then resistance to pesticides and antibiotics, which covers usually viruses and bacteria. So we'll start really quick with the fossil record. Remember that the fossil record is incomplete. I do want to talk about this really quickly. First of all, it's incomplete because we have to go find, right? We have to find fossilized species. And the species or the organism had to have fossilized. So there's kind of a list of things that must happen. So the first is that you must fossilize. Remember, it's hard to become a fossil. The chances of becoming a fossil are far, far, far less than a fraction of a percent. You have to be in an area that experiences quick sedimentation, which just means you quickly get buried. And typically you need to be in an area that doesn't have a lot of geological activity, so you're not going to be in anything other than sedimentary rock. Remember, igneous metamorphic rock, heat and warp and distort and put high pressure on fossils that destroys them. You also typically need to be in a low oxygen environment so that your remains are preserved and they don't decompose or decay too quickly. So you have to basically have all the right conditions to be a fossil. Second of all, you have to usually have hard body parts. If you're very, very soft-bodied, that tissue just decays and decomposes away. Things that are harder, like bone or chitin, like an exoskeleton, or lignin or cellulose, those can fossilize a little bit easier. So this is one of the reasons, for example, that we don't have things like fossilized eyes. The eye is a very soft, watery structure, and it's not good for fossilizing, right? So you have to be in the right conditions. You have to have kind of the right types of body parts that are easy to fossilize. Then humans have to come along, find you either on purpose or on accident, and then we have to know enough about fossils to say, hey, this isn't a regular old rock or stone, and we're not just going to throw it away. We have to keep it. Then we have to figure out what species it belongs to or what it's related to. We have to date it. So there's a whole bunch of steps you have to go through to become a fossil and to get entered into the fossil record. So the reality that the fossil record is incomplete should not come as a surprise. A lot of people like to say, oh, well, the fossil record's incomplete. You can't prove anything with an incomplete record. Well, it's a little bit misleading. Yeah, we would like for it to be more complete, and that's what time and research and diligence will get us. But the fact that there are areas of the fossil record we would like more info on does not mean the fossil record is by any means worthless. It's actually incredibly useful. It's one of the top 2 lines of evidence for evolution. I would say right there next to genetic evidence. All right, we have talked about the fossil record in general. We have talked about relative dating, and we have talked about absolute dating. This is the same as radiocarbon or radioactive or radiometric dating. Carbon dating, using carbon-14 as an example of absolute dating. So just a quick little overview here. This is an example here of just scallops in the Chesapeake Bay. To the untrained eye, if you didn't know what you were looking at, these might all look like they're pretty much identical or the same, but once we kind of discovered these different specimens and then had genetic evidence to back it up, we realized that, hey, this is a transition from kind of an older species up here in the top. It's kind of misleading because time is actually going down here, but to like a more, you could say more modern looking species, perhaps down here towards the bottom. And you wouldn't know this necessarily without the fossil record. And scallops are nice because they have this nice hard calcium carbonate shell that does fossilize very nicely and gets buried in sediment because they are aquatic. So excellent case study for using fossils to figure out the age of an organism over time. Here's some other ones. Here's the trilobite that you guys are all probably familiar with. So I'm going to keep going. Comparative anatomy is a new one. So what we can basically do is look at the bone structure of organisms, right? And it turns out, especially in the animal kingdom usually, the bone structures are almost identical. The only differences tend to be the length, the width, the density, and things like that of bones. So homologous structures are structures that develop from the same tissue but have different functions. So another way to think of this is the same evolutionary origin, same ancestor, but used for different things, used for different functions. And this is called divergent evolution. You do need to know this. And yes, this does imply common ancestor. So if we look at bone, this is a pretty common example, looking at the bone structure in the forearms and legs of all vertebrates. In humans, the bones here are colored. You have the orange bone, these yellowish, they look like yellow on mine, tan, and then you have the phalanges down here. That's what it looks like in humans. This is what you're familiar with, but cats, whales, bats, all mammals are going to have a similar structure. It's just the length and the positioning of the bones that changes. This is evidence of common ancestry. This is evidence of having the same kind of architectural origin evolutionarily, and that basic structure just gets modified for use. Humans use their arms to grab, cats use it to walk, so do dogs, etc. Whales use it to swim. They have fins, so they're broader bones for kind of water resistance to propel them forward. And bats have thinner, lighter bones for wings and flight. So different functions, but same basic architecture. Homologous structures. Let's see, same kind of thing here. Here's an example with a dog, sheep, other swimming animals, flying animals, etc. All right, so if you go across the animal kingdom, it's not just mammals actually, it is birds and reptiles. Tortuga is also a relative to other reptiles. So we'll talk more about what kind of diagram this is. It's called a cladogram. We can use it to visualize evolutionary relationships. But basically the ancestor to all of these structures is in the fish, actually, your lobe-finned fishes. And again, this is based on fossil evidence, it's based on genomic evidence, it's based on well, the lines of evidence that we're talking about in this video. The other type of structure is called analogous structures. So these are kind of like the opposite. These are different in evolutionary origin, but they converge on a similar function. Hence, this is called convergent evolution. And yes, you do need to know this. Human, bird, porpoise, etc., elephant. This is homology, this is homologous structures, but if we add in an analogous structure, and I know it's kind of cut off here, you have a bird wing and you have a fly wing, right? So in this case, between the bird wing and the fly wing, they're both used for flight, but the architecture is fundamentally different. Fly wings don't even have bones, actually, right? So different evolutionary structures, they actually evolved separately of each other, but they've converged on a similar environmental problem. In this case, it was the problem of flight. And you kind of end up discovering or evolving the same type of structure, in this case, a wing. Also notice that you don't have to have a full, what we would think of as a fully functional wing. Partial wings, skin folds, or flaps, like when flying squirrels, those kind of animals, those are not full wings, but the kind of the tissue in between digits allows them a little bit of lift. So even anything less than what we would think of as a perfectly formed wing is still evolutionarily useful. And that's actually critical to explaining how things like wings developed. It's realizing that rudimentary or earlier structures still had evolutionary value. All right, vestigial structures are structures that in the past had a much more pronounced purpose and use, and in the present, not so much. So an example of this are bones in organisms that you probably didn't realize had them. So whales and snakes have leg bones. They have pelvis and back leg bones, even though they don't have legs anymore. Humans have an appendix. There is discussion about whether or not the appendix plays a role in bacteria or being like a little haven for bacteria. But evolutionarily, this was mostly used to help us digest more plant-based matter. As we became a little bit more carnivorous, we kind of dropped the use of the appendix, and we don't really do much with it now, and actually it tends to get inflamed, and people sometimes have to have it cut out. They get appendicitis because the bacteria in there kind of grows out of control. But so I'll show you a good video of this actually in whales. We're going to do a whale video after this, and you'll see kind of all of these lines of evidence coming together and explaining how whales are actually mammals and not fish, right? But all of these kind of, leg bones, hip bones, femur bones, claws are present in a lot of snakes. They don't have legs, right? So, I mean, let's just think of this from an evolutionary standpoint or from a creator standpoint. It's a great question. Why would you create something? I'm not talking about any specific religion. It can be whatever religion you want. But if there's a kind of a myth story that says that something created animals, why would you create an animal that has leg bones but no legs? It's kind of a mystery. And really the only thing you can do is to kind of tell a cute story about it, or just say, well, that's how it wanted things to work. Which isn't really too satisfying of an explanation. But once you understand evolution, as I hope you see over and over again, this is my goal, certain things, and actually biology as a whole, really only makes sense in the view of evolution. Evolutionary theory can explain quite easily, actually, why organisms with no legs have leg bones. And that's because they are vestigial structures. Ancestrally, they had more use because these are reptiles that evolved from tetrapods, four-legged reptiles. But snakes lost the use of their legs. They were not needed in kind of the more drier, deserty environments that a lot of snakes live. And just they don't climb, they don't need to. They actually evolved kind of these circular rings of muscles that allow them to contract their body and move that way. So they lost the use of their legs, but they slowly kind of retained this kind of vestigially smaller, withered almost kind of architecture of their ancestors' anatomy. And those are vestigial structures. Again, evolution can explain this quite easily. Same thing in whales. Whales have femur and pelvis bones, but clearly don't have legs. And again, evolution is really the only explanation as to why. It's also one of the main lines of evidence for them being mammals, and again, we'll see that in the next video. All right, embryological development. Early on in development, when you are a single, or when anything is really a single cell, 2, 4, 8, 16 cells, and so on, everything looks the same. It's actually really, really hard to distinguish organisms apart from each other. And that's because the genes responsible for development early on are evolutionarily conserved. They're very, very old, and they're shared between all of these different lines of organisms. And actually, humans and mammals, vertebrates, all have gill slits, which in fish become gills, but in vertebrates we lose, or in non-fish vertebrates, those gill slits are they're closed, they're lost. And we actually have a tail. You have a tailbone. You have a coccyx, a tailbone. That's what it's called. You don't have a tail, but you have the remnants. You have a vestigial structure at the base of your spine. You have evidence in your body right now, clear as day if you just knew what it was, documenting your history as a primate. And that's what humans are. We're primates. We're apes. We're in that group of organisms. And we actually have tail structures. It's called a post-anal tail behind the anus in development. We don't keep it, we lose it, but we do have it in early development. And all of these similarities, again, is evidence of common ancestry. That evolutionarily, all organisms on this planet, at least, are descended from a common ancestor. And these developmental genes and the structures they build help tell that story. We'll talk more about this in class, but basically, very, very early on, if you just looked at this top row. Now, these are drawings, by the way. These are not actual pictures. In the video I show you about whales, I will show you actual embryos, but these are just drawings. Again, very early on, it's hard to tell organisms apart. It's hard to tell humans and salamanders apart very early on, or cows and fish very early on, because the genes that build these structures are all evolutionarily related to each other. It's not until later on in development, further on in the embryo, that these genes start to turn on and off in certain ways. That's more related to what you would recognize as being, oh, that's a human, or oh, that's a rabbit, or so on and so on. Right, molecular evidence is by far and away the most important line of evidence, especially since we've started sequencing DNA and discovered it, et cetera, from the mid-90s onward, from the mid-1900s onward. But the whole point is that similar organisms will have similar DNA. The more different you are, the less similarities you have. That's the whole gist. This is true for the literal sequence of bases, A's, T's, G's, and C's, as it is for the amino acids and proteins, right? The more similar two species are, the more similar their amino acids are in their proteins, and the different they are, the more different their proteins are. So what we can actually do is, if you have a sequence of nucleotides that codes for amino acids that get you protein, let's say this is the sequence, how many are there? 35 amino acids here. Maybe this is the protein for a human. A protein for a fish might have a couple of differences. It might have one, I'm just kind of randomly circling stuff here just to drive a point home. It might have 1, 2, 3, 4 differences for a fish, but for a chimpanzee, it might only have one difference, right? So the more differences, the less related two things are. So here we've got actually a cytochrome C is a protein found in the mitochondria of a lot of organisms, and that makes it useful because we can compare. So this is for a chimpanzee. Humans aren't on this one, but we would be identical to a chimpanzee's cytochrome C, actually. A rhesus is a monkey. It's a macaque, so there's one difference there. So these are pretty closely related. If you go down to, here's a whale. You can literally count the differences. That's the whole point, actually. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 differences between a whale and a human. Human's the comparison group here, right? Chimpanzee had 0 differences. If you go down even further, lampreys, which is a type of very, very primitive fish, have 20 differences, right? Tuna fish have 21 differences. Bullfrogs, turtles, 15 and 18 differences over here on the right. So the more differences, the less related we are. So what are we most similar to on this chart? Which organism? Well, the one with the least differences, right? The chimpanzee, and that's actually our closest living relative along with bonobos. The gorilla and the orangutan are also part of our kind of ape group, the great apes, but they are not as closely related as the chimpanzee and bonobo are. But this should also make some kind of logical sense, right? Typically, genetic differences correlate to some extent with what the organism looks like. And chimpanzees, I mean, think about it. Chimpanzees have the basic body structure of people and vice versa. Where actually it's easy to say, oh, the chimpanzee is so different from us. No, it's not. Have you looked at a chimpanzee? It's basically a small human if you look at its overall body architecture, right? I mean, compare it to something like a tuna fish. Like, that's different from a human, not a chimpanzee. So this kind of should make sense, that we're most closely related to chimpanzees and least closely related to lampreys, at least in this set of organisms. And the amino acid sequence, the DNA sequence data, all supports that. All right. One of the coolest things about evolution is that you do not have to wait millions and millions and millions of years. You don't have to have been there to know that things have evolved. And in organisms that evolve very, very quickly, we can actually observe this in our lifetimes. And this makes it even harder to dismiss evolution. If you can literally see it and measure it in a lab, I think it really helps make the concept more concrete, more tangible. And this is why a lot of model organisms that we use for evolution are small insects and bacteria, right? So if you have organisms that reproduce quickly, like very quick gestation times, generation times, insects that reproduce in a matter of days, right? Bacteria that reproduce in a matter of hours, right? These are perfect organisms to see evolution right there in live time, in a lab, and measure it right then and there. You don't have to wait millions and millions of years. So one case example of this that you are all familiar with is antibiotic resistance. This is why when you go to the doctor and they give you an antibiotic, they tell you to take the whole thing, because antibiotics kill the vast majority of bacteria. Most of the time they will kill all of the bacteria in your system, but it is common and it is likely and it's possible that some bacteria are resistant to it. And again, going back to what we talked about earlier, genetic variation is the norm. Genes mutate. Bacteria have a way of actually giving each other different chromosomes even. So eventually you will stumble across bacteria that are resistant to whatever antibiotic you have taken. Those bacteria that are resistant survive and reproduce. And the gene for the antibiotic resistance gets passed on. Therefore, antibiotic-resistant bacteria become more and more common. And this is not hypothetical. This happens all the time. One great example is MRSA. It's a bacteria that's resistant to a lot of the psyllins, the penicillin, amoxicillin, that group of antibiotics that end in illin. Actually, a lot of us are allergic to those too, but there are STDs or STIs that are resistant to a lot of medications too. Gonorrhea is actually one of them that is becoming very, very resistant to antibiotics. This is natural selection. This is evolution in real time, right here and now, in your lifetime. You don't have to read about it in a textbook. It's happening right now. It's happening with the coronavirus. I know the coronavirus isn't technically a living thing, but it evolves just like living things do. You have a South African strain or a strain that arose there in South Africa. Just last week, as I'm recording this video, there was news of a new strain that arose in the US. It's right here in front of our faces. Organisms and species change over time. They accumulate mutations, the environment selects on those mutations, and it's so obvious when you're dealing with bacteria and viruses and insects. But what you have to realize is that it also applies to everything else. It's harder to see when we're talking about mammals or humans or things like that because we have longer lives. It takes longer for a generation, right? A human generation is like, what, 25, 30 years now? you have to have tens of thousands and millions of years before you start to see obvious side effects of evolution sometimes. But with bacteria, with insects, with viruses, you can see these changes within years, decades will do it. Probably one of the most interesting lines of evidence because it's really, really obvious that life evolves. It's not static, it evolves. We can talk more about what these two plates are showing. I'm going to keep it out of this video just because it is a little bit of a longer video. So those are the 5 main lines of evidence. I hope this video helped. And in class, we'll watch a video on whale evolution that incorporates all 5 of these, or at least 4 of them, to tell a story of how whales are our mammalian ancestors. So I will see you then, and enjoy.